Hello, Ebenezer family. Pastor Kelly here sharing our devotional today. Psalm 78 is one of the few psalms written by someone other than David. In this psalm, Asaph sets out to encourage the people of Israel to remain faithful to God by remembering his saving acts and his persistent grace. We find this theme in the first couple of verses. Verse 4 will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his powers and the wonders he's done. Verse 6, so the next generation would know them. And then in verse 7 we read, then they would put their trust in God and would not forget his deeds, but would keep his commands. The writer then moves on to recall the role that God played in Israel's history as they traveled from Egypt to the land that God promised to give to his people. He divided the sea and led them through. He guided them with a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. He brought water from a rock when they were thirsty. And he provided manna, bread from heaven, and meat, quail, that settled on the camp miraculously. But then in verse 32, we find this. In spite of his wonders, they did not believe. And in 37, their hearts were not loyal to him, though they were not faithful to his covenant. The writer then recalls a second period from Israel's history. First one, and then now the second one, when God also acted miraculously on their behalf. God poured out plagues on the nation of Egypt in order to convince Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. Rivers turned to blood, flies, frogs, grasshoppers, and hail, to name a few, and then lastly, the death of every eldest male. Finally, Pharaoh lets the people go. But then in 56 and following, we find the writer speaks like he did in 32. But they put God to the test, and they rebelled against the Most High. They did not keep his statutes. Like their ancestors, they were disloyal and faithless, as unreliable as a faulty bow. They angered him with their high places. They aroused his jealousy with their idols. So what we find the writer actually identifying in Psalm 78, and it's quite a large psalm, is the recurring spiritual cycle of Israel. The book of Judges also records this, but on a lot larger scale. And here's what it looks like. God extends his love to his people, but the people rebel, they follow their own gods, their own idols. God then disciplines his people, and then they return to him. In Psalm 78, Asaph reminds his listeners of God's miraculous acts, their rebellion, of this cycle. God's amazing work is also shown, but then he showcases God's unrelenting mercy and grace. In the midst of the unfaithfulness of God's people, God continues to be faithful and loving. Verse 38, he was merciful, he forgave their iniquities. And then in 65 and following, then the Lord awoke as from sleep. He beat back his enemies, and he chose David his servant to shepherd his people. And David shepherded them with integrity of heart, and with skillful hands he led them. So in the midst of this historical perspective of the people of Israel, that actually makes it a bit tough to follow in this psalm. There are three things, I think, that we can take away. And here's the first one. We all have this propensity to drift away from God. We all have a desire to try and make it on our own. We all lean towards our own understanding. We all fight pride and self-sufficiency. Like Adam and Eve, we want to follow our own desire. The writer of the book of Isaiah says this, verse 53, we all like sheep have gone astray. Each one of us has turned our own way. The second thing we see in this psalm is that God is full of mercy and grace. It's a part of his character. It's who he is. In this psalm, we saw how God forgave the rebellion of his people. And if you've been following our Ebenezer Romans series, we've seen how God went to the utmost lengths to bring us to himself when we were completely and totally undeserving. Now here's the third thing. We can keep from drifting from God by remembering what he's done in our lives. We need to remember the gift of salvation through Christ, which God has given on our behalf. We need to recall God's provision, the abilities that we have, the job that we have for work, the family and friends, the spiritual family that we're a part of. All these are from God and much, much more. We need to cherish as well the miracles that God has done in us and through us and on our behalf. Now, a practical way that we can do this is, first of all, to recall these times in our times of prayer. The line from the Lord's Prayer, God, give us our daily bread. That's my cue to remember God's work in our lives. The second way to do this is to journal on these things, to write these things down. to remember them in writing. That's what the writer of Psalm 78 did. Asaph wrote these things down and then share them with the people around us. These are a couple of simple things that we can do to remember what God has done, and that in turn then keeps us from drifting away from God, like we all have this tendency to do. I'd like to just take a moment and pray for us this morning. Father, I want to thank you that you are gracious and you are merciful in the midst of our drifting. In those times when we tend to look away, in those times when we tend to trust our own understanding, you are there. You call us back. You're merciful, even in times when we are forgetful. Lord, help us to remember what you've done. Help us to remember, and in doing that, to draw close to you. Forgive us when we've drifted. We name those things for you today, whether that be in our work or perhaps we've made other things priorities and idols in our lives. We want to confess those, and we want to recall what you have done, and in doing so, be drawn back to you, our first love. And so, God, we give ourselves to you in this way today, thanking you for who you are and giving you praise. We ask it in your name. Amen. Thanks for joining us today. Before we sign off, I just want to remind you that at 10 o'clock on Sundays, we have our online service. You can find us on the website or through Ebenezer's Facebook page. As well, at 9:45, we have an online foyer, a time of just greeting one another through Facebook, and it's kind of a neat way to interact. So we'd welcome you to join us then too. Thanks for being a part of our devotional time today. Have a fantastic day. God bless.
You're a good, good Father. It's who you are.